My mother-in-law, Margaret, yelled loudly in the hospital, waving a folder of papers. She's unstable. She needs to be committed right now. I sat quietly, feeling oddly calm, my hand resting on a small USB drive in my pocket. My name is Olivia Parker. I'm 34 years old, and I never thought I'd be in a psychiatric emergency room while my mother-in-law tried to convince doctors that I was losing my mind. But Margaret always found ways to try to get rid of me. She talks to herself all the time, Margaret continued, pretending to be worried. She has angry outbursts and crazy ideas. Just last week, she accused me of messing with her medication. The young doctor looked at me, clearly confused by the difference between Margaret's words and my calm appearance. What Margaret didn't know was that I had been preparing for this for months. I first became suspicious 6 months ago when I overheard her talking on the phone. "Don't worry, I have a plan," she told her friend. "She won't be in my son's life much longer. I just need enough evidence." I married her son, David, 3 years ago. From the beginning, Margaret made it clear that I wasn't the kind of wife she wanted for him. I didn't come from the right family, and I encouraged David to start his own business instead of joining his father's law firm. "She's isolating David from us." Margaret's voice shook as if she were hurt. "He barely visits anymore, and when he does, she watches his every move." I almost laughed at the irony, but the situation was too serious. The truth was, David had chosen to distance himself from his family's controlling behavior. He wanted to run his own sustainable energy business, not become a corporate lawyer like his parents wanted. But Margaret blamed me for his choices. Dr. Stevens, the doctor, looked at the papers Margaret had given him. "These are serious claims, Mrs. Harrison," he said, "but we need to do our own evaluation." Margaret's face tightened for a moment, her perfect act slipping. "But I have proof," she said, showing more papers. "Look at these messages and emails. She's clearly unstable." I had to admit she was thorough. She had created fake evidence, including edited screenshots, fake diary entries, and statements from concerned neighbors who didn't even exist. Dr. Stevens turned to me. "Mrs. Parker, would you like to respond to these accusations?" I smiled calmly, my hand still on the USB drive. "I'd like to speak with you alone, doctor." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "No, she'll lie to you. She's very manipulative." Dr. Stevens stayed calm. "Mrs. Harrison, it's standard to speak to the patient in private. Please wait outside." Margaret tried to argue, but a nurse gently led her to the waiting room. She looked back at me angrily, clearly upset that her plan wasn't going perfectly. Once we were alone, Dr. Stevens asked, "Would you like to tell me your side of the story?" I took out the USB drive. "I'd like to show you this first." He took the drive. "What's on it?" 6 months of evidence showing that my mother-in-law has been trying to make me look unstable. There are videos, phone recordings, and detailed notes of everything she's done, including planning this visit to the hospital. Dr. Stevens plugged the USB drive into his computer. As he watched the videos of Margaret planting fake evidence, listened to her phone calls, and read my notes, his face became serious. "I set up security cameras after I heard her plotting against me," I explained. "Everything is dated and verified. I also have reports from my own doctor and therapist confirming my mental health." Dr. Stevens looked at me. "Mrs. Parker, this is very troubling. But it's about your mother-in-law, not you." Her actions seemed very calculated. I nodded. "That's why I documented everything. I knew she was planning something like this." "Does your husband know?" he asked. "No, he's on a business trip until tomorrow." Margaret knew that and planned this for when he was away. She wanted me committed before he came back. Dr. Stevens made some notes. "You've handled this incredibly well. Most people would have reacted emotionally to such harassment." I knew that's what she wanted, for me to act out and prove her right. So I stayed calm and kept records. Dr. Stevens stood up. "Mrs. Parker, what she did, trying to get you committed with false evidence, is a serious crime. Are you willing to file a formal complaint?" I felt relief wash over me. Yes, it's time she faced the consequences. As he went to make his calls, I thought about Margaret sitting in the waiting room, probably imagining me being taken away in restraints. She had no idea that her plan was falling apart. The USB drive had been my safeguard, my proof of the truth. Now it would be her downfall. I pulled out my phone and texted David. It was time he learned what his mother had been doing. The emergency room was busy, but I stayed calm. ignoring the 3 missed calls from Robert, Margaret's husband. She must have called him when her plans started falling apart. I put my phone on silent as Dr. Stevens returned with 2 police officers. Mrs. Parker, one of the officers said, introducing himself as Detective Morris, "We need your statement about these allegations of attempted false commitment." I nodded, noticing Margaret pacing on the other side of the glass wall. Her face turned pale when she saw the police. "She's been planning this for months," I explained, showing the detective more evidence on my phone. "Here's a recording from last month where she talks about getting me out of the picture with her friend Sandra. And these are emails she sent to doctors, trying to create a fake history of mental issues for me." Detective Morris looked through the evidence, his expression grown serious. "This is detailed. The amount of planning is worrying." My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Landing early. What's going on?" "Dad called saying Mom's at the hospital with you?" I quickly replied, "I'm fine. Your mom tried to have me committed. Come to Memorial Hospital. Bring your laptop." Dr. Stevens asked, "Would you like us to speak with Mrs. Harrison now?" Before I could respond, Margaret stormed into the room. Her calm act was gone. "Why are the police here? This is a private family matter." Detective Morris faced her. "Mrs. Harrison, we need to talk about your attempt to falsely commit your daughter-in-law to a psychiatric facility." Margaret's face twisted with anger. "I was trying to help her. She's unstable. She's been spying on me. Isn't that proof she's paranoid?" I couldn't help but smile. "No, Margaret. It shows I was ready. Every time you showed up uninvited, planted fake evidence, or plotted against me, it's all recorded." Her face turned red with rage. "You little mother." David's voice cut through the tension. He stood in the doorway, laptop in hand, his face filled with confusion and anger. "What did you do?" Margaret's demeanor changed instantly. "David, thank goodness you're here. I was just trying to help Olivia. She's not well. I was only—" "Stop," David interrupted firmly, setting up his laptop. "I want to see all this evidence." For the next half hour, David watched the security footage of Margaret sneaking around our house. He listened to her phone conversations where she plotted against me and read her manipulative emails to doctors. With each piece of evidence, his face grew darker. "You did all of this?" David asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "You tried to get my wife committed." Margaret's eyes filled with fake tears. "I was protecting you. She's changed you, turned you against us, convinced you to throw away your future on that stupid energy business." David cut her off. "My business is successful. I'm happy. Olivia supports me. The only one tearing this family apart is you." Detective Morris spoke up. "Mrs. Harrison, you'll need to come to the station to make a formal statement." Margaret's plan was crumbling, her perfect image shattered. Her son was seeing her true colors for the first time. "David," she begged, "you can't let them do this. I'm your mother." "Yes," David said quietly, his eyes cold. "Which makes this even worse." He looked at me. "Olivia, do you want to press charges?" I looked at Margaret, seeing not a powerful enemy, but a desperate, broken woman. "That depends on Margaret. If she agrees to get counseling and keep her distance, we can handle this privately. But if not—" Margaret's mouth dropped open. "You're blackmailing me?" I shook my head. "No, I'm giving you a chance to fix this before it gets worse. It's your choice." Margaret realized she was out of options. Her shoulders slumped, her fight gone. "Fine," she whispered. "I'll get counseling." David wrapped his arm around me. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "I had no idea she could do this." The police took Margaret's statement, and Dr. Stevens documented her attempt to falsely commit me. It was over. Her plan had failed, undone by the very things she accused me of. Careful observation and preparation. As the police led Margaret out, David turned to me. "How did you stay so calm through all of this?" I smiled, thinking of the months of planning, the careful collection of evidence, and the patience it took. Sometimes the best way to win is to let someone think they're winning, until they lose everything. 3 months after Margaret tried to have me committed, life slowly returned to normal. Things were different though. Margaret went to counseling every week, just as she had promised. David added more security to our house, and family gatherings felt different now, quieter, more careful. One morning, I was having coffee in our backyard when David handed me an envelope. "Letter from Mom," he said. As part of her therapy, Margaret wrote me letters every week to practice better communication and respect boundaries. The letter began, "Dear Olivia, today in therapy, we talked about control and why I felt the need to have it. I realized my actions weren't really about you. They were about my own fear of losing influence over David's life." At first, her letters were full of excuses, but over time, they became more sincere, showing she was trying to understand and make things right. It would take a while for me to trust her again, but I appreciated her effort. "How is she doing?" I asked David. He still met with his mom once a week, but only in public places as we agreed. "Better," he said, sitting beside me. "She actually asked about my business yesterday. No comments about law school or my wasted potential. It's progress, I guess." The hospital incident had forced a lot of truths into the open. David finally talked to his father about all the years of pressure and control. Robert, shocked by Margaret's actions, started going to counseling with her. Their marriage was changing too, as Margaret learned to let go of some control. Sandra, who had helped Margaret with her plan, sent me a long apology email, admitting what she did and saying she was sorry. I forgave her but kept my distance. Some things just couldn't go back to how they were before. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. "Would you meet for coffee next week? My therapist thinks it's time we talked face to face. Only if you're ready." I showed David the message. 3 months ago, this would have felt like a trap. Now, it seemed like a genuine attempt to make peace. "It's up to you," David said, squeezing my hand. No pressure. I thought about the USB drive with all the evidence I had gathered, still locked in our safe. I hadn't needed it since the day at the hospital, but knowing it was there made me feel safe. "I'll meet her," I decided. "In public during the day, and I'll drive myself." David smiled. "You're setting good boundaries. Your therapist would be proud." The next week, I arrived at the coffee shop early and picked a table where I could see both exits. Old habits die hard. Margaret arrived right on time. She looked the same, but her eyes were softer, less sharp. "Thank you for coming," she said as she sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." Honestly, I wasn't sure either, I admitted. We sat in awkward silence until our coffee arrived. Margaret spoke first. "I've been trying to understand why I felt so threatened by you. My therapist says it's because you represented change. I fought so hard to keep control that I nearly ruined everything." I stirred my coffee, thinking before I spoke. You know what's funny? If you had just given me a chance, you would have seen that I never wanted to take David away from his family. I just wanted him to live his life the way he chose. Margaret sighed. "I see that now. Seeing him succeed in his business, seeing how happy he is. I was wrong." We talked for almost 2 hours, facing hard truths and setting new boundaries. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As we got ready to leave, Margaret hesitated. "That day at the hospital," she said, her voice shaky, "you could have pressed charges. You could have ruined me. Why didn't you?" I thought about the USB drive and the months I spent gathering evidence. Because winning isn't always about destroying someone. Sometimes it's about giving them a chance to change. Margaret looked at me, understanding in her eyes. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "No," I agreed. "But I'm giving it anyway. Don't waste it." That night, I told David about the meeting. "It's strange," I said, "but I think I understand your mother better now than I did before." "Well, you're both stubborn and strategic," he teased. "You just use your powers for good." I laughed, thinking about how differently things could have turned out. I could have used the evidence to destroy Margaret's reputation and tear the family apart. Instead, it forced everyone to face the truth and grow from it. A year later, I deleted all the recordings and videos. Not because I fully trusted Margaret, but because I no longer needed them. We had built something new, not quite friendship, but mutual respect. Margaret still sent me letters every week, but now they were about her progress in therapy and genuine questions about our lives. She even started volunteering at a women's shelter, using her need for control to help others regain theirs. Sometimes the best victory isn't defeating your enemy, but helping them change. Margaret's plan to have me committed had failed, but in the end, it brought about the changes we all needed. "No regrets?" David asked, noticing my thoughtful look. "None," I replied with a smile. Sometimes a broken plan is exactly what it takes to fix what's truly broken.